If you've just joined us, we're giving it a few more seconds to let everybody enter, and then we'll get started. Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Ams Committee on Education Forum on the Evolving Curriculum in High School and Early Undergraduate Mathematical Sciences Education. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. This is an urgent topic. I don't think anybody's really happy with the status quo. It's just not working out well for many students. And today we're lucky to have some really insightful panelists here with us, and we'll have a great discussion. And I'm also happy that we've got a very broad audience. We've got faculty from a really wide range of institutions. We've got math educators and math education researchers. We've got government employees. And this is exactly the sort of audience we hoped for. The thing is, we can't make progress on these sorts of issues in isolation. We need cooperation among people with a broad range of backgrounds and expertise. And that's exactly what we've gathered today, and I'm really looking forward to it. So just to introduce myself, my name is Henry Cohn. I'm a mathematician at Microsoft Research and MIT, and I got involved in this forum because I was formerly a representative on the AMS Council. And I'll be one of the moderators today, along with Yvonne Lai from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Kate Stevenson from Cal State Northridge. Let me say just a few words about each of them. Yvonne got her PhD in hyperbolic geometry and geometric group theory, and she's really a leader in the study of mathematical knowledge for teaching. And she'll be working mainly behind the scenes today, keeping an eye on the Q&A and helping to make sure everything works smoothly. Meanwhile, Kate's an algebraic geometer. She spent a 3-year term as chair of the Ams Committee on Education, and she's also had a really wonderful 10-year collaboration with the LA Unified School District. And Kate and I will be monitoring the panel discussion today. So let me give Yvonne and Kate a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Yvonne, and thank you for the kind introduction, Henry. As I'm looking down the participant list, I can see a lot of people who've spent years, if not decades, really working on all aspects of math education, from work in the K through 12 to first year efforts to teacher education. And I'm so glad that we are in a Zoom room, as it were, with so many thoughtful listeners.
So hello, everybody. I'm Kate Stevenson, coming from Cal State Northridge. And I'd like to point out, we also have another dimension of diversity in our audience and in our panelists. We have people representing Research One universities, comprehensive universities like the one that I'm at, master's granting, universities that are majority minority serving, first generation serving, and universities that have a less diverse population. So I think that we've pulled together the right community so that we can listen and learn about the different perspectives to try and find some way forward. So let me hand this back to, oh, before I do that, we couldn't do any of this work without the help of many people. So in particular, the AMS Committee on Education, this group led by Dev Sinha, who from the University of Oregon were the initiators of this meeting. And so we're very grateful to them. Also special thanks to folks from the Dana Center, Dave Kung, Alicia Smith Arriaga, Uri Treisman, from MAA, Michael Pearson, from NCTM, Ken Kreibel, from CBMS, from CBMS, Charlie Steinhorn and Shelley Jones, and from AMS, Leonora Harris. So let me hand it back to Henry.
Thanks, Kate. So just so you know what's coming up, we'll spend a few minutes talking about what we have in mind for outcomes from today and a few norms for the discussion. After that, the speakers will introduce themselves and their work with some brief presentations, and we'll follow that with a panel discussion and Q&A from everyone attending. So to begin with, I just wanted to highlight the AMS Council's recent statement on this matter from the April Council meeting. And I'll let you read it, it's on the slide, but let me summarize the situation like this. There are some things that we can all agree on. We all want more students to learn mathematics well. We all want these students to have full access to the opportunities that are enabled by mathematics. And these sorts of goals have really led to a lot of innovation in the sort of content that's being taught, in pedagogy, in assessment, in different sort of pathways for the study of mathematics. And these innovations come from a lot of different sources. Some come from individuals, some from departments or school systems, some from professional organizations, publishers, other sorts of governmental bodies. There's a lot going on here. And really, nobody can resolve these issues alone. They're just too big and too complex for that. And our only hope of really making progress is if broad communities can join together in dialogue between people with very different sorts of expertise and experience. And we've all got a lot of stake in mathematics education and many perspectives to share. And in line with the AMS Council statement, the AMS really values having its members being well-informed on these issues and thoughtfully engaged. And that's why we're here today. I want to say that these sorts of topics in mathematics education are really complex, and it can get very contentious. You might remember the so-called math wars in the 1990s, which were sort of spurred by the NCTM's curriculum and evaluation standards for school mathematics. And this was a real mess. We don't want a repeat of the math wars. I don't think that will leave anyone better off. And the question is, how do we handle these sorts of discussions? And whenever you have a complex issue like this, it's natural to have disagreement. I want to emphasize that what we're hosting today isn't a debate or an attempt to settle these issues. Instead, what we want to do is get some sort of an idea of what sort of reforms are being discussed, where they're coming from, what motivates them, how they might play out in practice, and to discuss these amongst ourselves and just try to figure out what is or isn't common ground among people working on this and where more thought and discussion is needed. And along these lines, this can be a really fraught emotional topic, that there are people who feel very strongly about what these changes might have meant for them when they were students, positive or negative, that how this might affect their children or their students in the future. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and I think it's fair to say that we all share the same ideal big picture goals, but we've got a lot of different priorities and different personal experience. And there can also be tension between different sorts of expertise. There can be mathematical research, there can be applications and sort of subject matter expertise, there's educational research, there's classroom teaching experience. And when discussions get heated, it's really easy for people to feel like their perspective and their expertise aren't being valued and respected. And we really want to avoid that. So what I'd urge you to do today, if you have strong feelings, is to take a step back from arguing and really try to engage openly and sincerely here. Our goal isn't to score points, to debate, or even necessarily to achieve an overall consensus. We may or may not end up agreeing, but this is an opportunity for us to learn and think together. And we put a few principles up here on these slides that we really hope will govern the discussion, the Q&A. Please keep these in mind. I want to say one thing about my own role in this. I'm really not an expert on K-12 education. I certainly have the least expertise of any of the organizers or speakers, and I'm not here to present myself as an expert. Like a lot of us, I'm personally and professionally interested in this topic, but it's not really the focus of my scholarly work. And instead, I think of my role as moderator as kind of being a proxy for the audience, that I'm here to sort of provide, every mathematician's perspective on this, say. So I'm really excited to be here. We've got a wonderful lineup of speakers. And as Kate and I said, the audience is really broad and interesting. I'm sure there'll be great discussion in the Q&A section. So what we'll do is we'll begin with some brief presentations just to give the speakers a chance to set the stage and introduce their work and ideas. So the speakers we'll hear from are Ricardo, Moena, Ji-sun, Brian Conrad, Gail, Burrill, and Bill McCallum. So let me hand things over to Kate to introduce the speakers and moderate that section of this discussion.
Super. Thank you, Henry. So today I will introduce each speaker and then they will speak, and then I will introduce the next speaker. We will move to the Q&A after we've heard from all of the speakers. So you don't need to hold your questions. We're perfectly happy to have you put your questions into the Q&A as you go. As Yvonne mentioned in the chat, please, if possible, address your question to one or two of the panelists, because that'll help us direct. We won't have each panelist answer each question. We will try to target them. So let's start off with Ricardo Moena, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio. At the Ohio Department of Education, Dr. Moena is currently the chairperson of the Ohio Transfer 36 Mathematics, Statistics, and Logic Review Committee. This committee reviews submissions of college-level courses for guaranteed transfer among the 36 public institutions of higher education in Ohio. Also, Dr. Moena chairs the Ohio Mathematics Initiative subgroup focused on the revision and redesign of the Ohio Transfer 36 criteria. So Dr. Moena, Ricardo, all yours.
Well, it's very nice to be here. I am going to go briefly and describe the Ohio high school math pathways. Can I share at this moment?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Let me see. We're here. Share. And can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. So the Ohio high school math pathways. This is in response to the work that we initiated 12 years ago in the Ohio Math Initiative, where we already have in higher education aligned courses by degree programs pathways. So we found out that the Algebra 2 Math 3 requirement for all students in high school was not meeting the needs of everyone. The project started 5 years ago. High school faculty teaching these courses are required to attend summer webinars and schedule bi-weekly meetings with team leaders to monitor progress during school year. And you can see there that as an alternative to the Algebra 2, we have the statistics and probabilities, data science foundation, discrete math, computer sciences, and quantitative reasoning. These are all pilots that are currently ongoing in the state. One of the issues that many faculty had was, are these pathways easier than the Algebra 2? So we adopted a standard, rigor. We said all of these pathways should have the same measure of rigor. And this is the definition that we're using. Students use mathematical language to communicate effectively, to describe their work with clarity and precision. demonstrate how, when, and why their procedure works and why it is appropriate. Students can answer the question, how do we know? We see the pathways in high school as an expansion of what is already going on in colleges and universities. Project leaders from the Ohio Department of Education met and worked with faculty and administration of the higher institutions to ensure that the pathways were rigorous enough to prepare students to take a college credit-bearing mathematics course as their next mathematics course from high school. Now, let me show you the geographic location of this project. The Data Science Foundation, we started in the year 21-22 with 15 high schools. Then in the year 22-23, currently we have 21 high schools involved in the pilot. The learning outcomes and the pedagogical approaches, both to deliver the objectives, were designed by teams composed by both high school and college faculty working in teams. We also have a mathematics, modeling, and reasoning. That one started in the year 2019. And as you can see, as time progresses, the number of high schools involved is growing. Right now, we're at 68 high schools this year. I don't know if you're familiar with the shape of Ohio, but you can see that even though it looks like a lot of places, it's not evenly distributed, the courses. The rural areas do not have too many of these stars. Most of them are concentrated along the highways corridors there, 75, 71, and 70. And that is because of the nature of the districts in Ohio. We also have a new one here. We started this year with discrete mathematics and computer sciences. There are 10 high schools involved in this project. And you can also see that the distribution is along the major cities in Ohio. We haven't been able to move toward the servers or the countryside yet. Data is being collected. So, and due to the local nature of the administration of school districts, there are 611 in Ohio. The process is very slow. And as you can see, as I was showing you on the map, is not yet uniformly distributed across the state. Those are the pictures that I have. I really think that the situation in Ohio is such that we've had conversations with both 2- and 4-year institutions. And I cannot say that everybody was extremely happy at first. There were a lot of concerns that they had having high school students using these alternative pathways. But I think that they're beginning to understand that this is something to which we should try, that it opens the possibility to go to college to a much larger number of students, and that it's going to take a while to measure really the effect of this. Is that my 5 minutes?
You have about a minute left if you want to keep going, but congratulations for setting the standard very high for the rest of the speakers.
I was trying to keep it very, very short. Yeah. But if anybody, when these are available, so anybody wants to see them, just let me know.
Great. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Okay. So we will move on to our next speaker, Ji-sun. And just to remind everybody, please, if you feel comfortable using the Q&A for your questions, you can also upvote questions as you see them coming in on the Q&A. So Ji-sun is a professor of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles, just down the road. She's a co-author with Jim Stigler of the interactive textbook, Introduction to Statistics and Data Science, a Modeling Approach. This is used by thousands of high school and college students, available through coursekata.org. She holds a PhD in cognitive science and psychology from Indiana University in Bloomington. Go ahead, G.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me into this space. I want to acknowledge I'm an oddball because I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a statistician of any kind. I'm not even in a math department, for heaven's sake. Why am I here, right? And really, I'm a psychologist and a cognitive psychologist. And we really think about what is inside students' heads as they're learning about math. And so I want us to think a little bit about division for a second, right? So if you think about how kids learn division, they think about, I learned to divide integers, and then I learned to divide fractions, and then I learned to divide decimals, and these things have nothing to do with each other. And the whole goal is to figure out which one of these things am I doing so that I could do the right sorts of procedures, right? And sure, you're using the word division, but let's be honest, it's not helping me at all, right? And when they learn about other things like factoring polynomials or least common multiple, they're like, oh, those are also their own separate things. Try not to think about division when you think about those other things, because that's not a very helpful construct for us, right? And that's really unfortunate because they think to themselves, math is about sorting problems. Like you get a problem and you got to like ding, 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 activate the right sorts of things. And so don't even try to think about what these things have in common. Think about what separates them. Math is about cracking things into more and more tiny, tiny little bits. And hopefully that breaks your heart just a little bit right now, right? Because experts, they kind of understand, well, these are all division, the details, schmetails, right? And experts find this higher order coherent organization really useful. And research has shown this kind of connected understanding, it helps you learn new things faster. It helps you transfer. It helps you have a more coherent worldview. It even helps you memorize things better. And actually, we have evidence that experts actually all think of all these things as multiplication. They don't even think of it as division, right? And so they have this very interconnected point of view, which is something that students don't have. And some people think, oh, teach them statistics. It's so relevant. It's so engaging. There's so many like applications. And honestly, teaching them statistics doesn't necessarily make the situation better because you could also crack statistics into a bunch of little bits too. You could also teach it in such a way where students think, oh, all these things are unrelated. The only thing that these things have in common is that they're tests of statistics or something like that. Statistics also sorting. That's what makes statistics math, right? Like that's a really terrible way to teach statistics. But students eventually kind of have this idea, oh, there's this stuff and the higher order concept is this is stuff you learn in a stats class versus things like functions, which is stuff you learn in an algebra class, and don't ever try to put those two things together. And we think that's a really unfortunate picture of the world, because if students had this interconnected understanding that a lot of that stuff that they learned in good old algebra and geometry are actually useful in statistics and other mathematical practices, and those things are all connected to real world scenarios, they would be better at transfer. They would be better at applying their learning. They would be better at learning new mathematical concepts. The world would feel coherent to them. And I wish, this is my sincere wish, that students could see that algebra, like things like functions, is actually useful for modeling the world, that they could see, oh, these are the COVID numbers in reality. And when the New York Times says, oh, look at these models, that they could say to themselves, oh, these are fancy little functions. And some functions take this into account and some functions take that into account. And just because no one ever said f of x in this article, they're not bothered by that. They still recognize these things all as functions. So CourseKata.org, this community of researchers, developers, and instructors, I'm representing a whole big team. We are a curriculum of statistics and data science that focuses in exactly on this strategy, helping students practice connections to core concepts instead of just learning like 100 bits. And our curriculum is used in early college and high school in over 40 institutions, many of them in the state of California, because that's where we're located. And And we really emphasize a modeling approach because we want students to think that their algebra stuff is really useful in modeling the world. And we think the idea of the model is a really important bridging and core concept. We have a full interactive textbook as well as a set of Jupyter notebooks because we use R, the programming language many times used by statisticians and data scientists, as well as the notation of the general linear model. And we have this full curriculum and it's taught in high schools in 1 year and it's taught in colleges in 1 semester or a quarter. And we really think of our curriculum as helping students make the transition from solving with algebra, solving for X or Y, to modeling with algebra, where you don't have to know what X and Y are. You care about the relationship between X and Y. And this curriculum in the high school has been implemented in a number of ways. The most popular way is to, after kind of the algebra sandwich, to offer it as a 4th-year math class. And this is often for students who actually would not take any math in their 4th year without this class. They're very much like, I'm done with math. I never want to see anything to do with math again. They're like, oh, data science, that's not exactly math, right? Okay, maybe I'll take that. And so this is one option. Another option is that students are now taking this as their 3rd year math course. And some students are learning about functions in a way where they're like, gosh, I wonder if there's a way you could like have a curved model. And then we're like, there's a whole class for that. And it's called Algebra 2. You want to take that, you know? And so we're hoping to get students back excited about algebra and functions again. And another way is that students are learning, oh, wow, I want to do more coding. I want to do more data science and more things like data wrangling or data cleaning. And so we have a data science 2 class offered as a dual enrollment option with community college. And finally, we also have an option that we're developing now with AP Stats curriculum, Skew the Script, where course kata data science 2 would follow AP Stats so that students would take all that stats knowledge and then apply it. And so that's kind of our perspective. And I hope I get lots of questions from you all.
Thank you so much, G. Again, staying right on target with the timing. I want to remind everybody we have the Q&A and you can vote up questions. So that will help us as organizers to really focus on the questions that are of maximum interest to our participants. So next up is Brian Conrad. Brian is a professor of mathematics and director of undergraduate studies at Stanford University. He oversaw the modernization of Math 51 at Stanford, a course addressing skills in linear algebra and multivariable optimization that underlie quantitative work in many science and engineering fields. The modernization of a service ODE course and the creation of a summer course to address background gaps in high school math skills for incoming freshmen. Brian, all yours.
Okay, thanks very much. So I don't have any slides to share, so I'll just tell some stories for the time. So just in terms of some brief background, so I've not been extensively involved in K-12 education for most of my career. My father is a high school math teacher, so I've always had somewhat of an, kind of an interest in what's happening in the particularly in the high school level and transition to college. I've been the director of undergrad studies here since I think 2013. So the thing I'd like to first talk about is an experience we had with overhauling our biggest math course here, which is the first multivariable calculus course. So one thing that often happens is, of course, with these large classes, one's beholden to the textbooks, and many of these courses, the layout of the textbooks has not changed in many decades. And one thing that we did here was we put linear algebra at the beginning. So students maybe have taken a single variable calculus course, but rather than have them go through the standard derivatives and multivariable integrals and Stokes theorem before they ever see linear algebra, we actually sort of put linear algebra at the beginning. And so our first course is focused on linear algebra and multivariable optimization. And for many students who are, let's say, not going to be going into engineering, maybe they're going into computer science or data science and so on, this is most of the math that they're going to need. And what we saw happening was we had a tremendous drop in the enrollment of our earlier version of the course. Engineering departments are becoming aware that if they offer cool versions of basic math classes, they can attract a lot of students. And this can be quite devastating to the math departments, because when those students flee and start taking the courses from the engineering departments, then it has many consequences that can be really problematic. In any event, so we realized that we needed to overhaul our course. And what we did was, we knew the math content was valuable that we were teaching, but we talked a lot with colleagues in many other fields, economics, statistics, computer science, and so on, data science, to find out what are lots of very interesting, motivating examples to convince students that, high dimension linear algebra and its application to high variable optimization are very important and useful. And what we did was we underwent I think it was a 2-year project where we set up our own new curriculum and we wrote our own book. And so this was a team of 6 or 7 faculty just volunteering to do this. In any event, the upshot was that the colleagues, told us all kinds of interesting examples that we never would have learned about otherwise. And we rolled out the new course, and it was a phenomenal success. I don't know how many engineers are in the audience, but anyway, we crushed the engineers course, and all the students came back to us. And so it was very successful. But I think that, so the 2 main lessons that we got from this were that if you're looking for, it's very hard, right? If you mostly work in a math department, to come up with really compelling examples that will appeal to students from all these other fields. But if we just go talk to our colleagues in these other fields, there's all kinds of cool stuff that they know about that often people in the math departments may have no idea or have never heard of. And anyway, so that was really eye-opening to us. And what we've done is, we don't spend time in the course going into the applications in any great detail. First of all, students come from many different backgrounds. But the point is that by having the examples in the book, and students can read according to their interest, then it keeps things much more engaged. You just spend like a minute in class saying, here's this cool situation where it comes up, and then you go into the math, but those students psychologically, at least they're more primed to be willing to listen. In any event, so we had tremendous success with that. Kate, what time did I start at, by the way?
Sorry, I had muted myself. You have about another 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Even 2.5.
Yeah, okay. In any event, so we found by putting the linear algebra early on, it saves students. They don't have to wait until much later. But of course, the challenge then is, we wrote our own book, and what I hope can happen over time is maybe publishers can be convinced that it's more useful to do that. But then, of course, it requires a lot of coordination with the other departments. And so here, this was a huge effort that we had to undergo, but it's been really, really great for us. And the university is very happy with the math department now. So I would encourage, to the extent possible, if it's, if you can move linear algebra earlier, I think the students can really appreciate it a lot. And I'll just say very briefly, we did a similar thing with our service differential equations course as well. That again, we were stuck using a mass market textbook. It had very boring examples. And we talked with colleagues in other fields, astronautics and so on. And there's lots of cool stuff that you never find in textbooks. And we put that into our own in-house book. And again, the students are very, very happy with the newer version of the course. The last thing I'd like to briefly touch upon is the issue of high school pathways going into college. So one thing we often see here, and I'm sure it happens at many colleges, is that students' interests will, of course, evolve. They get to college, they think they want to do X, and then they realize, okay, they're instead interested in something else. And so one thing that we just have to, I think we have to be very careful about is that as high school pathways emerge, there was a risk of a kind of Tower of Babel problem. So for example, a student may think in high school they're very interested, let's say, in computer science, but they don't necessarily know that college degrees in computer science now often require calculus, right? And things like that. And so we often have here happening that students will arrive thinking they want to do something, but then if their math background was too narrowly specialized, it can create downstream effects. So I just hope that as schools begin developing more and more of these pathways, that the extent to which students still have many options open to them and won't run into problems down the line will be kept in mind. So some communication between the university faculty outside the math department and the high schools, I think, can be very critical to making that transition stay fairly smooth. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. And I think that key of communication across segments, across diverse experiences is a theme that we're going to see coming out a couple of times. Just so we have two more speakers, each of whom will speak for about the same amount of time. Then we will move to the Committee on Education to see if they have any questions they'd like to voice. And after that, we'll come to the Q&A, which I'll remind you is over there, and you can upvote questions. I see that you're doing that, so great. Our next speaker is Gail Burrill. She is currently a mathematics specialist in the program in mathematics education at Michigan State University. She has served as president of NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and president of the International Association of Statistical Education, and as director of the Mathematical Sciences Education Board. Gail, welcome.
Thanks. Can I share my screen?
Absolutely. I'll stay on until I can give you a thumbs up to see that you're working there.
All right. So let me get my PowerPoint up here just quickly. It's very amazing to me that all of us are seeming to talk about exactly the same things or the same ideas about making sense more for what we're doing in school mathematics and intro classes so that we can get more kids engaged in what mathematics really is all about. And I want to just talk just briefly about the document Catalyzing Change. This was put out by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics in 2018, and it was in response to concern over what was going on in high school math in particular. The document received such acceptance and was widely treated as a really good place to start. It was called Initiating Conversations, that we went, the NCTM put out one for the middle school and also one for the elementary school. And I just want to point out some of the things that have occurred to me. I was part of the writing team, as was Yvonne. And I just want to point out that, so we are actually currently, what's going on in high schools has really been stagnant for the last 50 years. And it has really not moved ahead or recognized where the world is. So I just copied some outlines of chapters from some typical books, and I will credit the fact that the IM curriculum actually has added statistics in the beginning of its book in 9th grade, I think, except at the end, as most people do. But for the large part, much of what we teach has really not changed at all. And this is one of the things that happened during the pandemic. So I was reading this book by Barry about his dog. And he's called Lessons from Lucy. And he talked about how much fun he used to have when he was a young lad or when children were young and they could play and frolic, just like the dogs could play and frolic. But at some point, the dogs can continue to play and frolic, but kids start school and eventually the activities become less fun, leading inexorably to the cosine. And I thought this was kind of interesting and sad commentary. So I want to just talk a little bit about what catalyzing change is and why it's important. And you all know this, but I think in what we were doing in school mathematics, lost track of the fact that mathematics was originally developed in order to understand and critique the world. And just because people were interested and liked the challenge in trying to figure out some of the things that were uniquely understood thinking about mathematics. And so one of the major foci of this book document is to rethink the purposes for teaching mathematics. So not just focusing on college and career ready, which is what we've done for many, many years, but keep that as one of the core things that's important, but also add in, understand and critique the world and experience the joy, wonder of beauty of mathematics and statistics. And as those of you engaged or involved in the mathematics world, I think we all can reflect on the fact that pretty much getting the joy, wonder, and beauty got lost, at least in much of what I used to teach when I was a high school math teacher. So this document talks about essential concepts for all students One of the things that's an interesting thing that I actually was very, very pleased about is it has the typical categories that you would expect, but it also adds in the statistics and probability section, it adds in a section on quantitative literacy. And to me, this is an extremely important thing that I have been hoping for since the NCTM standards in 1989, because making sense of percents, ratios, proportional relationships, even linear and exponential functions, in terms of being quantitative literate, is really, really important, and more so now than ever before, when we have things like screening tests and efficacy and all of these things, herd immunity, that are coming up, that are mathematics in the real world and involve grown-up percents, which is what I call them. The other part that was really integral to what was going on in Catalyzing Change is that it attempted to raise our consciousness of structural barriers that limit access for many, many students. And these structural barriers include who teaches what. It's pretty well known that the more experienced more teachers with the most background in mathematics often get to teach those who are going to calculus, while those with least experience and limited background teach the rest. Who gets to take what and when. And we do have some very unconscious barriers in many places for who gets to go into mathematics. I actually know that in my old school, you were only supposed to go into an accelerated program if you had been identified in 6th grade as gifted. That nobody knew what the 6th grade teachers I used to categorize mathematically gifted. Fortunately, we didn't know about that, and we just chose kids who really liked math and wanted to go on and do more. And so one of the pieces that this raises is this notion of acceleration versus tracking. So I'm all for acceleration for students who need it. The document Catalyzing Change is as well. Tracking, not so much. So one of the differences to me in this is that tracking puts students into places when they have no control over how they get there. Someone else makes the decision for them based on some criteria that might not even be relevant. And that limits their opportunities. And too often, once they get in a track, they have a label on their back and they can't get rid of the label. Acceleration says, okay, some students are actually really interested and eager to go on and learn more mathematics. Those students should be given that opportunity. The important thing is that the mathematics that all the students take should be essentially the same. So all kids should have the opportunities to take like through Algebra 2, and that Algebra 2 should be essentially the same Algebra 2 for all students. They might not take it at the same time. They might not take it in exactly the same way, but the content should be there, and all students should have that opportunity to show that they can do the kind of mathematics that's necessary in order to go on into and satisfy the mathematical requirements that are important for entering STEM fields and going on into the university level. I just want to kind of close with some key takeaways from Catalyzing Change. To me, that I think have guided both what I do in my own teaching, and that I think is some of the strong messages that comes from it. And it includes the modeling components that we heard about. It includes the idea that we are thinking harder about what's important for kids to know and to be able to do. And so one is this recenter the purposes. The second one I didn't talk about, but it's leveraged the role of technology. So technology is absolutely crucial if we are to engage kids in these modeling activities, in these different kinds of activities. We need to shift from learning procedures to making sense and being able to use and interpret mathematics. We need to ensure all students have the same opportunities. As I said, the statistical quantitative literacy is that really important. And we need to consciously think about system barriers inhibiting opportunities and access. So as school communities, we should look at the makeup of the population in our advanced placement calculus class and the makeup of the population in our 9th grade, and decide if we see some kind of barriers that are getting in the road of access. So I forgot how much time am I out of?
I think you're about up, Gail, but if you have some just closing comments.
No, this will do just fine. I was just going to share some thinking about the technology, but that's good. So thank you very much.
We'll push those questions to the Q&A. Hopefully they'll come up in the later sessions. We try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. That's why we're holding our speakers to this tight time limit. Our last speaker is Bill McCallum. He is an emeritus distinguished professor of mathematics at the University of Arizona. He was the lead writer of the Common Core State Standards in Mathematics, which earned him the Distinguished Public Service Award from the American Mathematical Society and the Dociniani Award from the Mathematical Association of America. He's currently the CEO and co-founder of Illustrative Mathematics. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm just going to say a few words about illustrative mathematics, the work we're doing in developing high school courses, some thoughts on how we solve the problem of student engagement. I'm fortunate to be coming last because a lot of what I want to harp on, people have already said. For example, I liked G's comments about the coherence in mathematics. One of the things we did when we were trying to write the standards was to really present mathematics in a way that is visibly coherent and in progressions across grade levels. And so that, for example, division is seen as the same thing. However, there's a big difference between writing standards that say how you want the mathematics to look and having it actually look like that in the classroom. And I've been on a journey ever since I got involved in writing the standards to try and move forward on that journey. That's what led to the founding of Illustrative Mathematics. It started out as a simple project that was only going to last a year to provide sample tasks, illustrating the meaning of the standards. And here we are 12 years later, and we're still going strong. I don't want to give you an entire history of illustrative mathematics, but an important step we made around 2015 was to decide to start writing curriculum aligned to the standards, because we just weren't seeing out there that next step being taken. Writing standards, they don't implement themselves. The next step is to write curriculum that really aligns to the standards. And so that's what we started doing. We came out with a middle school curriculum in 2017. We came out with a high school curriculum in 2019, and we just released our K-5 curriculum in last year in 2021. The curriculum that we've come up with is freely available, K-12 core mathematics curriculum aligned to standards. It's released under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, which means anybody can take it and use it. Commercial providers can even commercialize it. It's comprehensive, aligned to the Common Core. It's available at illustrativemathematics.org, and it's currently in use by 1.5 million students nationwide. I want to share one slide here because I think it addresses some of the issues that have been raised. It's our attempt. So let me actually share my screen. And because one of the things we tried to do was to base the curriculum on this, create a problem-based a curriculum that supports problem-based instruction. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that students are allowed to struggle with the mathematics productively to figure out if they can solve a problem before they're told how to solve it. A synthesis at the end of that process is really important here. There are 2 steps. Let the students work on the problem and then synthesize their learning. Those 2 steps are really important. They have to happen in that order according to a lot of the research on how students learn best. So we built this sort of overarching design structure into the curriculum that at every level of grain size, it starts with an invitation to the mathematics, followed by some deep study of concepts and procedures, followed by consolidation and application. And This happens at the unit level. So every course has about 8 units. It happens at the lesson level, and it happens at the activity level. Every unit begins with an introductory lesson, which is really meant to engage students, get them interested in the mathematics, and a bunch of lessons. And then there's always a culminating lesson where they apply what they've learned to some sort of large problem. At the lesson level, every lesson starts with a warm-up, which is meant to get students' juices flowing, classroom activities, and then very importantly, a synthesis. The teacher makes sure that the goals of the lesson have been met. And then even at the level of each activity within a lesson, you have a launch, work time, and a synthesis. So we always have this common structure. The other thing I want to say is that we designed the sequence of lessons really very carefully to balance conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and applications, and to build up concepts over time with some intentionally designed sequence of representations of the mathematics that are really meant to not just be ways of doing the math, but ways of understanding and learning the concepts. I want to address a little bit the, there is some of the urgent issues that have been raised are the idea that we need more statistics in the curriculum, we need more probability in the curriculum, we need more modeling in the curriculum. I will say, so lots of documents have been sort of saying this over the years. Catalyzing Change is one. Common Core State Standards themselves responded to this call. The Common Core State Standards had a lot of statistics in them. They are still the standards of many states, named or not. So there are state standards that say you should put quite a fair amount of statistics in the high school curriculum. That doesn't mean it always happens in the classroom. But for example, and I'm just going to take you briefly to, just to sort of illustrate the, where are we here? The IM curriculum, just to sort of walk you through a little bit of some of the features that we have around modeling and statistics and modeling. So the IM curriculum is, as I say, it's available for free. You go to curriculum.illustrativemathematics.org. The algebra curriculum, as Gail mentioned, starts with a unit on one variable statistics. That's this invitational unit, which is meant to be a unit which gets people interested in the mathematics. The Algebra 2, and there's also a unit on two variable statistics placed after the unit where students learn about linear equations. It's a natural place to put a unit on two variable statistics. Geometry has a unit on conditional probability, and Algebra 2 has a culminating unit on statistical inference. So all of that is really quite a good dose of statistics already. And one of the things people talk about modernizing Algebra 2, I think that a curriculum that follows the standards and that is following this problem-based instructional model is already going a long way towards what you might call a modern Algebra 1, as defined, for example, by the Dana Center document. The other thing I just want to point out, and I think I'll stop then, is approach that we took to modeling. So modeling is something where you really want students to go beyond just solving word problems. They have incomplete information. They don't necessarily have, they're not necessarily given a mathematical model. They actually have to come up with one. That's hard. And it's not necessarily something that happens within the structure of a single lesson. So we designed these modeling prompts, which are sort of outside the lesson structure that throughout the year or the semester, teachers can give to students. And the feature, I'm not going to go into any detail about them, but one feature I just want to point out is we tried to meet teachers where they were in terms of the difficulty of getting their students to do this themselves, feeling a little bit anxious about giving students really big open-ended modeling tasks. And so we designed every modeling task with sort of 3 versions of the task statement. One very open-ended, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the initial statement of this modeling task is, you've got an animal rescue organization that wants to try and spread the word. It wants to try and do some fundraising. How is it going to do it? And there are 3 strategies outlined, and it says which strategy would likely yield the better outcome for the organization. Well, that's a very open-ended version of the question. But this particular prompt then goes through two more that are much more scaffolded. And so there's a sort of an attempt to try and meet teachers where they are, meet students where they are in introducing some of these things. And I think that's the locus of work that we really need to focus on. In addition to thinking about standards, frameworks, and curriculum, we need to think about how we help teachers move from where they are to where we want them to be in a way that is intentional, carefully thought out, and it's not sort of just some grand fantasy recommendation. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
That was an absolutely wonderful way for us to end this list of speakers, centering ourselves not only on the students, but also on the people who serve the students, the teachers, sure, without whose success we can't achieve success. So we're going to move into the next phase. Just as a little sorbet course, Henry and I will take the privilege of moderator to ask a couple of questions while we let the Committee on Education and our other guests who appear as panelists on your screen probably think about what questions they would ask, and then we'll move to the Q&A, which Yvonne has been scouring through, culling together as coherent questions. So Henry, was there a question that came to mind for you so far, or even just a comment about commonalities that you heard?
I thought there was a lot of commonalities between the different presentations. For example, I really appreciated the role that sort of more sophisticated views of the subject matter, its connections, its applications, what we really wanted students to understand could play, the role that this could play. This came up in a number of the presentations. And I also, one thing that really I liked was also Gail's sort of nuanced discussion of acceleration versus tracking, which I think is an issue that often really gets sort of oversimplified in Twitter debates, say. In terms of things this made me wonder about, one thing I was curious about that came up a little bit in Bill's discussion regarding working with teachers is if you have something like, you know, the course kata statistics and data science course, or for example, Math 51 at Stanford, I'm curious how one evangelizes for this, how one works with teachers to make it successful, that if you just sort of drop a new curriculum in someone's lap and say, the course is different now, that sounds tricky. And I'm curious whether any of the speakers have thoughts about this.
So one of the things that we're asking the people asking questions to do is to direct their questions to somebody. Was there one person in particular, Henry, you'd be curious to hear from?
Let's start with G, actually.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then G, you can popcorn it to somebody else that you think, oh, I want to know what does he think about that, or she?
Definitely. Yeah, because, you know, I think we think a lot about how if an innovation is stuck in one teacher and one classroom in one institution, it's like, oh, is there an innovation at all? You know, and so we really think about how to do continuous improvement for a broad range of instructors, including high school teachers, but also like a community college math faculty member that might be handed a statistics course, but their primary training is like not in statistics. And so even for them, they're like, I've never actually analyzed data, and I'm being asked to teach intro stats because my college has a lot of intro stats courses. And so we have a extensive PD, and we think of PD in this very developmental way, where we start off instructors as students in a 6-week study group. And right now it's free. So go to coursekata.org if you want to, if you're interested. It's being paid for by the Chancellor's office at the CSU. Thank you, Chancellor's office. And we start teachers off there. And when they start using the materials, we have office hours every day on Zoom. We have a Slack channel where they actually tell each other, hey, my students are interested in gun control. My students are interested in marine biology, and they could share lessons and data sets with each other, swapping Jupyter notebooks. And we also think of it as, we have the starter pack, but as instructors get more sophisticated in their understanding, they actually become more flexible. And so at first they're sticking very close to our starter pack. And then it's that second year where they really blossom. And so we think of it as, I think I remember teaching stats for the first time ever as like a fresh out of grad school kind of kid. I was like, what am I doing, right? It's really only after you miserably failed that first time that you get your sea legs, right? And we see a lot of that process going on even with our teachers. And our teachers had it even harder because they had COVID at the same time. So it was like, it's not enough of a challenge to teach a new curriculum. And I thought, I'm interested in Brian's course actually, because that's one of the things we're really interested in too, bringing in experts who are in engineering, who are in marine biology, and so how to incorporate that. And so I'd love to hear more about your course.
Yeah, well, in terms of, the design aspect, we sort of settled on the math topics initially, but we had to adjust. So like one, my favorite example of what opened our eyes was we walked into the statistics department to meet with a professor there. And the first thing he said to us was, he said, "You guys aren't still teaching row reduction, are you?" And, if he had not said that, I don't, it's like, would that have occurred within the math department? Like, yeah, let's drop row reduction. And, it's like, how do you teach linear algebra without row reduction? Like, what do you do? But then anyway, we thought about it, and yeah, we came up focusing more on matrices and the structure of matrix algebra. And then the students actually, that's much more interesting because you can do a lot more with it than just solve equations. And so there were other instances like that. And so in any event, I think that's I think it both helps to provide examples, but even in terms of which math topics to teach, it can make us realize that maybe we should focus in a certain direction and not in another one that's more traditionally done. But one has to talk to these other people, and it takes a lot of time because there's also a communication challenge, right? Because the way they think about something may not be the way that we do in the math department. So you have to figure out what exactly are they saying and then unravel it and then express it in terms that we're more familiar with. So that can also be a little bit of a challenge at times.
I think that's a beautiful parallel. I was really struck when listening to the speakers about the parallels between the challenges of a math department changing its upper division or its math specific, undergraduate courses, and the challenges that high school teachers face. The idea that we need to make the mathematics challenging, intriguing, we need to be curiosity driven, and how some of the current curriculum can really lock teachers into a fairly dry presentation that isn't curiosity driven. Maybe I would ask, the other thing that's jumping out at me, and I'm curious to hear more from Gail, one of the difficult, and I'm trying to model, so people get very upset about some of these topics, and one of them is pathways. And you talked about pathways versus tracking. I think a lot of time there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress about, and Brian mentioned this in his presentation as well, about creating pathways that then have such high walls that somebody isn't going to be able to port back over to even a STEM light field, like an elementary school teacher needs to know enough math to do that. These are very common entry to the middle class jobs. So law enforcement, teaching, nursing, these are the careers that my students would be looking to for security. So Gail, I wonder if you could speak to that, to what you see about that anxiety.
So yes, I totally agree. In Catalyzing Change, the one offering of a pathway was 2.5 years of kind of standard math, the essential concepts for everyone. And in my way of thinking, there's a lot that we are teaching that we don't need to teach, like row reduction. There are things in our current algebra, geometry, algebra 2, that can be let go. And there are things that we should approach in a different way. I think in this 2.5 years, it's kind of the core is what the Catalyzing Change says. you can actually give kids the mathematics that they need, that would let them go, whether it's as a junior or maybe that takes them until the senior year, that can go to a course that might still get them into the right places for STEM and for the things that they need for entering the university. I think all kids should have that opportunity. Some kids will get it earlier than other kids. But I see no reason, and I know this from my own experience when I was the department chair for many years in a high school, that's what we did. For instance, we dumped Algebra 2 for students who really mastered the things that they needed to know earlier, and they just went to pre-calculus and to calculus. And because there was so much overlap between it then, I'm not going to challenge Bill right now and see if there's overlap. There was so much overlap then between Algebra 2 and pre-calculus. It really didn't affect the learning of anybody. And so the thing we have to pay attention to is how we structure those pathways to give everybody these opportunities. And I will say, I was just in a state that shall be nameless. It's not where I live, that is looking to 2 years of core mathematics. And I'm worried that that 2 years is going to be algebra and geometry. And I'm worried that that will then cut off all these great things that Bill's talking about, and that Lee's talking about. It won't, that's not going to be enough for what all kids need. And it's going to leave 2 years of kind of a vacuum. And so even though we think about these pathways, we can't have a vacuum that we channel kids into, that they're not ready to do the kind of mathematics that we want them to do in order to be prepared to go into the STEM fields. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my thought.
Completely. I'm wondering if there's one other person who wants to jump in on that. Otherwise, we will move to our Committee on Education and other invited guests. Do I have any questions from that group? You can raise your hand and unmute yourself. I'll call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. Come on, folks, don't be shy. While they're girding their loins to ask a question in front of our illustrious group, I'll just point out you can use one nice use of the chat might be to point out commonalities that you're hearing. Where is the common ground that you're hearing amongst our panelists? That would be a really nice takeaway. It's one of our outcomes for this event. So if you want to drop into the chat, we'll keep track of those, stick them on a Google Doc to share with you later. So please feel free to use the chat to note those things. Dev, take it away.
Hey, so thanks again, everybody, for coming today. One commonality I heard is a stronger emphasis on modeling. I heard that in pretty much all 5 panelists, which is fantastic. It makes sense from a policy perspective. As much as I love math, I don't think that's why state boards of education generally require lots of math. But I had sort of 2 somewhat related questions. Well, how do you teach modeling well? I wanted, the panelists talked about that a little bit. Maybe I'll ask Brian, because that's a more familiar context for me as a college faculty. Like how do you get students sort of into those aspects of modeling? Brian, maybe Bill as a follow-up. And then secondly, for anybody who's done that, do you find that you then need to ditch some topics here or there because you allowed time for ambiguity and question formulation, or does it seem to kind of work out once you make space for it?
So maybe I'll just say something very brief in response. So as I say, the balance that we decided to strike in the end, and this is partly, we're on a quarter system, right? So time for us is a little bit of a precious commodity compared to a semester system, is we wrote out in the course textbook detailed discussion of like how the material is used for specific applications. And so in class, there might just be a kind of brief discussion, like here's an interesting situation, and then it leads us into this math. In class, we mostly actually just focus on the math. We use the modeling context as a segue, but the students are told, if you're interested in this, and then see this page of the book. And so then those who are interested can read that, but we don't have time for that in the class itself. But And students have such different backgrounds. I think it could be that would be a big challenge, of course, to get into the details of specific applications. But anyway.
Definitely. And I think it's something that high school in general, we have a little more space for. Bill, you want to jump on that?
Well, I think I'm going to sort of just repeat what I think is the main issue here, which is helping teachers, because there's no shortage of good modeling problems. We put all these modeling prompts into our curriculum, but the life of a teacher right now is pretty packed. I think modeling is something that's not just going to happen inside a single lesson. That's why we created these modeling prompts. So there's a time issue for teachers. And there's also, you're asking people to sort of step off a cliff. I mean, you know, give your students a very simple problem without much information and saying to them, hey, take it away. That's scary. And I think if that's all you do, the students are just gonna sit there and stare at you. And so we tried to build in a lot of supports for the teachers about how to implement the modeling prompts. That's why we had these sort of scaffolded versions of them, guidance on how to evaluate student answers. I just think professional development is a large part of implementing a curriculum. I mean, in answer to an earlier question, we side by side building our curriculum, built a very extensive suite of professional development offerings that are linked to the curriculum. And I think getting beyond curriculum in our thinking is an important step. Thinking about the whole classroom. Are all the pieces and parts coherent? Is the instructional practice is the curriculum supporting good instructional practice? The assessments that teachers are being told to administer their students aligned with the curriculum. So a whole classroom picture, I think, is important.
Thank you so much. Jesus, and then we'll move to the Q&A.
Hello. Thank you very much for this. Is very nice to see that there's actually a lot of agreement on the things that have been said. For example, I mean, since we were asked to note the agreements, I believe that the teachers need to be helped to implement any changes. I mean, the changing the programs is not so easy. So I was very happy to hear that many people agree with this. Another thing that I found that is very important is communication with many stakeholders. Like, for example, Brian Conrad mentioned that talking to the applied departments in a university is very important. So let me ask you my question, and I will, since I'm supposed to direct this question to a specific person, I'm gonna choose Brian Conrad, but I think everybody can have an opinion. So my question is, as a college faculty, I teach at UC Davis, and I'm in California. So right now we see a lot of tension. I mean, about the California mathematics framework. And I think there's a lot of anxiety, let's say just anxiety and concerns and things like that. And I find myself thinking often, so what is the truth? This is essentially my first reaction to statements being said, you know. And then the second thing that I notice as I observe the discussion on these topics is, well, how can we get together? I mean, we seem to agree at least in one point, which is that mathematics education in the United States is not in good shape. We're not doing our job very well. So my question I'm gonna start asking this directly to Brian, is how can we create a mechanism for mathematicians, let's say in college level, that don't have the time to see what's going on to read the entire, for example, California mathematics framework, or they don't have to learn more of, let's say, the information of what is really true. And the second part of the question is, how can we bring everybody together? Because I think you seem to accept, everybody seems to accept that we need to bring everybody together to solve this very difficult problem. Thank you.
I think the best thing is for people who have the content expertise to talk directly with the people who are, teaching in the high schools. I mean, I don't see a way around that. Anyway, I don't want to speculate on causes of the current difficulties, but I think bringing in people from industry and higher education, people have a sense of like, where is it going? But again, not just from the math department, right? From other departments, and somehow have them, and then communicating with people who are, working in the high schools or developing curriculum for the high schools, that the expertise, that mix seems to me a kind of crucial thing that was missing in the current situation in California.
So before we go over to the Q&A, I'm wondering, Ricardo, since you've been exactly doing that, you've been crossing from the university context over to the K-12 context. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's absolutely necessary for faculty from 2 4-year colleges, even research universities, to network with high school faculty. The way we are doing it is we are gathering what we call teams. And these are stable groups that are composed by faculty from all of these institutions. And they actually meet bi-weekly with the faculty in high schools that are teaching these courses to discuss the progress, to come up with ideas. They also are involved in suggesting pedagogies, how to do it, and relevance. For instance, somebody up in Lake Erie doesn't have the same reality that somebody living in the southwest of Ohio, where it is cold country. So they're looking into all of those details to make sure that the students are getting a message that they can understand, relate to, and be interested in. That's the approach that we're taking here. Yeah.
Thank you, Ricardo. I see that Malcolm, who's the chair of the Committee on Education, so I was going to move to the Q&A, but since he's I'll give him a chance to ask his question. That's the sort of person who brought us here. Malcolm, I think you're muted.
Great. Well, Kate, you're the person who brought us here, but I would. To me, there's a overarching question here of it's kind of this this conception that mathematics is hierarchical, and so there's a lot of there's need for my students in my class should be prepared with the prerequisites from previous courses. So we're all talking about motivating students to enjoy mathematics and so on, but there's also this sort of level that seems to be that seems to be underlying a lot of the arguments over what our curriculum should be. It's just what are the prerequisites, and is it important enough? Is row reduction is that really important or not, or is how much do they need to be able to manipulate rational functions and things of that nature? So I would like to hear some comments more directly on how do we come up, how do we decide how that hierarchy is supposed to work, and or does it, or maybe it's, as I use the word that this is a conceptual thing, maybe it doesn't even exist, but any ideas on that? I don't know who I should ask specifically, but maybe Bill, is that something you want to aim for?
I mean, one of the tensions when we were writing the standards was exactly the tension you're describing between the sort of logical structure of the subject and the pedagogical structure of the students' minds. And there's always this tension between, should I, in order to, logically, this topic comes before this topic. But it's conceivable that in a sort of, you might take a pedagogical approach where you start at the end to sort of inspire students to think about it. And then that inevitably leads you back to the prerequisite topic. And so those are questions that are solved sort of case by case almost, or maybe they're solved by design, and you can take a particular design approach. And so we often try to think about making sure the sort of progression of ideas logically was visible, but not always letting that sort of completely dictate what order things are done in. In fact, really the standards don't specify order exactly, they specify some global structure. That's a curriculum problem to solve, but it's a hard design problem when you're writing curriculum, which we struggled with when we were writing out. I think sort of math, just like one more thing. The math wars often, I think, you have to keep in mind both the logical structure of the subject and you have to keep inside what's happening in the minds of students. And I feel like math wars are often, which one of those are you paying lip service to? And trying to actually pay attention to both of them simultaneously and honor them both is really hard.
Definitely. G?
Yeah, and I love something that Bill said, where it's like the emphasis has to be what is logical in the mind of the student, because it turns out, unfortunately, that taking algebra is not the equivalent to learning algebra. And when a student gets a C in Algebra 1, they have such an incoherent understanding of variables and equations and the equal sign and how it all fits together. And so it really feels like, oh, crap, they didn't learn Algebra 1. That's really the problem, that so many, and people were even talking about, you look at Algebra 2 and really they're talking about just Algebra 1, half of it is Algebra 1. And you look at pre-calc and pre-calc is actually just Algebra 2. And so I think there's an issue of measurement and assessment here too. Is it really about the standards and just making sure that classes cover this, or that students learn this?
That's beautiful. Okay, so I think we're going to move now to the Q&A. So Yvonne, are you pinned now? Just wait for that to happen. We have a lot of great questions, so I'll hand it over to Yvonne.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much for everybody who's contributed a question, whether it's in the Q&A box here or to the hosts and panelists. I've recorded all of your questions, and I hope that I'm able to synthesize these so that we can have our speakers weigh in on as much of these questions as possible. And just as an order of business, what I'm going to do is I will re-chat the questions that I'm going to pose to the speakers in the chat so that we all know what is actually being answered. So the first one is maybe especially to Ricardo and G and Gail. But a few participants, Ben Long, Chase Fisher Hall, Juan Gutierrez, Margaret Baer, and Pamela Bergman have all brought up high school requirements, including possible ill effects of students not being required to take Algebra 2. And this is in Texas and possibly in some other states. And so the first question that they ask is, what are the high school math requirements in your particular state? And maybe this influences the sort of context that you work in. What are some courses that students can take if they don't take Algebra 2? And what would you say to a critic who's concerned about sequencing mathematical knowledge in particular ways? So let me chat that in. And maybe Ricardo, do you want to start?
Yeah,
and maybe Gail and G.
Students take these alternative courses to Algebra 2 in the 10th or the 11th grade. In Ohio, we still have a 3-year requirement. Algebra 2 can be replaced by geometry and I forget the other, computer sciences, I think. Most students right now are taking advantage of dual enrollment. So after they take, for instance, a data science course, they find out that they're really interested in data science, and they go back and take pre-calculus course. Some of them, they take a statistics course. They decide that they're going to go into the health science careers, for instance. One of the advantages of having the student taking the alternative courses to Algebra 2 is that there is a motivational fact there. The student wants to do it. And that experience may direct the student to a better choice in the future sequence of mathematics or another choice. So that's what we have right now. In the future, I believe that we will require 4 years of math, so students will have to take a college credit plus or a dual enrollment course in the 4th year. We don't want to have anybody not taking math for a year. That is one of the worst things that can happen in the process of learning. Yeah.
So do you want me to jump in, Yvonne? So I'm a little nervous about, because I'm actually standing out in the future, I'm a little nervous about keeping the language of Algebra 2, because that creates in our minds a set of content outcomes that I'm not clear are the content outcomes exactly that we should be trying to think about. So I kind of like positioning it more in terms of functional knowledge. What understanding of functions should people bring to or whatever platform that they're going to move from? What understanding of symbol fluency? How fluent should students be with interpreting and making sense of symbols? And I'm not talking about necessarily symbol manipulation. That would be another question that actually relates to my technology perspective. But I do really think we should not focus on every kid should take Algebra 2, because anybody who's been in a school situation knows that Algebra 2 is just a name for putting kids in a second year of algebra. It doesn't necessarily imply that there's any essential role of sequencing mathematical knowledge in particular ways. It just implies that this kid has been plopped into this course, and he may or may not take from that course the knowledge that we really want them to take away. And so I would encourage us to not use the word Algebra 2, but instead to talk about the conceptual ideas, the big ideas in math that we think are important for students to take from these different content domains that we've typically talked about. And I just want to say one other little tiny thing, two things. First of all, in Michigan, we have a 3-year requirement, but the legislature several years ago, I haven't looked to see if it's still okay. They replaced Algebra 2, could be replaced by computational thinking. But my guess is, from reading what was going into this, that computational thinking was arithmetic. I am fairly convinced that they didn't know what mathematicians mean by computational thinking. So I would worry about that. And the other thing I would worry a little bit about, and I support what Bill said about his careful thought about how you orchestrate these ideas in some kind of a sense-making progression, because if we think about how mathematics, many ideas in mathematics did not develop in a logical progression. They were not the mathematical logic. The community imposed the mathematical logic once we figured it out. And now we've kind of turned it on its end and say, okay, let's start from the mathematical logical, the logical progression of these ideas. That's not necessarily the way kids think about this and the way it was developed. So I think Bill's approach is the way to go, is to think about what makes sense for kids. How do we put this together in a coherent way? And in some curriculum, something might happen in grade 9, and it might not happen until grade 10 in another curriculum. But as long as they're constructed so that they feed into each other to make a complete picture of the idea, I think that's the important thing.
I feel like I should always go after Gail from Bill. I really love a lot of the things she said, because that's exactly what we find too. It's the content of Algebra 2 is really amazing and important. And, so many scientific things are actually modeled by y equals 1 over x. Like, it's like explains like a lot of the world, but it's like, students don't recognize that is or is not a polynomial. Like, they're like, I don't know. It's like, do you want me to solve for it? Like, that's what they care about. And we're like, no, we just want you to appreciate 1 over x. Just appreciate it. Look at it. Like, see that you could do stuff with it, that it's really useful. And they're like, yeah, but is that on the test? And we're like, no, that's not. And so part of it is really talking about the contents of Algebra 2 that actually are really important. One of the things that we think is, when you look at data science and you look at models, students become very motivated to model things better because they're really dissatisfied with linear models, as they should be. And they want to be multivariate. They want to add curves, right? And then they want to know, well, why are some curves like this and some curves like that? And there are mathematical principles behind that. And we want them to appreciate those regularities. But, you know, some of our students, when they come in from Algebra 2, they don't even recognize that a quadratic equation is a polynomial equation, because they're like, no, quadratics, you do other things. You have to use this formula. And that really breaks my heart. And it's like, I'd really like for students to have this coherent understanding of Algebra 2. And so we could even imagine a Algebra 2 plus data science course that's a little less statistical and a little more leaning on just the functions and a simple measure of error. And that really is a straight shot to machine learning. Like I could see machine learning from there, right? And so there are really wonderful things you could do, but we really have to think carefully around what is the content that we really want students to understand.
Thank you so much for those responses. I want to echo something that Kate had typed into the chat about how, you know, one common ground that we can find is that learning and mathematics learning should be driven by curiosity, you know, intellectual about the world, for beauty. And I think what you're all saying about that resonates with that idea, and also trying to articulate exactly, you know, what is it that we're trying to motivate people to learn, and not just, you know, use a short phrase like Algebra 2 or algebra or geometry or even data science to capture that, but really drilling down into the specifics of what it is that we want our students to be learning. On that kind of topic, you know, we framed our session today with an acknowledgement of a need to improve our educational system. And I just want to highlight two questions from Jolie Honey and Juan Gutierrez about what are the actions being taken to provide students opportunities for more students in, say, rural areas to have options to have various pathways or to learn what it is that they need to learn. And then Juan also mentions structural barriers. And so this question was phrased to Gail and Ricardo, but any other speaker, if you'd like to address that, just let me know.
Go for it, Ricardo.
You're muted. Ricardo, you're muted.
Yeah. You could see from the distribution I show you in for the alternatives that we have, that the concentration is happening mostly around the cities, large cities, and the corridors in I-70, I-71, and the highways. And there is a reason why it has not spread out that much yet. First of all, resources in small communities. The entire idea is based on networking. To bring a high school teacher from a remote area, for instance, to Columbus for a webinar or for a meeting is quite difficult. So what we're trying to do right now is trying to look at regions within the state and declare each one of those regions kind of responsible for spreading the gospel around. The pandemic put a big dent to those efforts. Right now, we're beginning to come out of it. So the expectation is that in a couple of years, we're going to be reaching rural areas more often than now.
Thanks, Ricardo. I totally agree with you. So this is a really, really challenging problem. Partly it's very challenging because the teachers in many of our rural areas are the only teacher of maybe 7 through 12 mathematics, and B, they often are not the most experienced or well-prepared teachers. A friend of mine just took a job at a reservation in northern Wisconsin, and she is probably the first real math trained person to be in that school. And she is trying to figure out how to bring their curriculum, the students, and the principals, the tribe, into this picture about moving forward. So part of the problem is not just getting kind of the information out there, but getting the resources to support the teachers and give them the kind of understanding and motivation. And unfortunately, unless states make a deliberate effort to do this, I really don't see how we're going to actually bring some of these people into the thinking that we know can take place. And we also talk about the wrong stuff when we talk about some of these things, because we are not often talking about, I am the lone teacher and I am teaching everything. Sometimes I'm teaching 3 subjects at the same hour with us in the same room, because that's the only way I can offer students the things that they need. So we can't, I just find myself often not realizing the challenges that those teachers have to put up with. And so that's a education issue that every state faces, I think. And I think unless maybe our organizations can actually put a face to this problem and try to collectively alert states that this is something they can't ignore.
With permission of Yvonne, I was just going to jump in. One idea that's come out of the CSU that I'm heading up is to use dual enrollment for this purpose. So you have a course taught by, say, CSU faculty, but co-taught with the high school teachers in the rural districts. So you're doing 2 things at once. You're bringing content directly to the students, but you're also bringing engaged professional development, both for the teacher so that you can bring them up to being fully credentialed. We have 2 levels of credentialing in California, but also so that the person from the university is getting that direct experience of understanding where students are at in those districts. And then you work with those teachers for a few years and you leave that school now with fully credentialed teachers. It's not something that has to go on forever. You're creating the actual capacity within that school. One of the things that can be difficult with rural districts is maintaining that connection over a long period of time. So I just throw that idea out there for everybody. Okay, Yvonne, your next question.
Thank you, Kate. This is just, yeah, I mean, when sometimes I think in our mental models of what happens in education, we have a tendency to turn back to our own experiences as students, or perhaps look to our children's schools or our friend's child's school and think that, well, that must be the way that it is everywhere. And if we only knew how to fix that, then we could have such a better system. But in fact, there's a lot of variation in what teachers and students experience across the country. And I'm really glad that Gail and Ricardo, you were able to highlight some of the ways that things can be really different in different places, and something that we should be all aware of. So I'd like to turn now to a question that was addressed to Brian and G. And this is a combination of questions from Mark Saul, Curtis Bennett, and Rick Cleary. And the theme behind each of those questions is, what happens when this curricula is implemented? And so, for example, and we already addressed a little bit of this in the question just answered, but what supports do teachers need when they're implementing the programs? Do you have data on long-term student outcomes? And do you have any ideas on what the experiences of the students are? So again, this is to Brian and G.
G, why don't you go first?
Okay. This is something we love because actually we're learning scientists at heart. And so we have fully instrumented our textbook. We have over 1,500 formative assessment questions in the textbook. So when we say, oh, high school students are doing this and college students are doing this, we're getting anonymized data back, and researchers are looking at clickstream data as well as their sentiments, as well as their just even things like how many times do they retry to debug their code so that eventually it runs. And so we're looking at all of that data right now, and it's still very nascent because we're in the 3rd year of being in high school, so it's still pretty fresh data. And also COVID actually kind of changed a lot of this, because part of the big issue we're having is a lot of zeros, like just students not showing up, or, you know, they had like a prom that was like a super spreader and, you know, those kind of things. And so we're already seeing, one of the biggest things that we see is that we could see where people are improving, where high schools are struggling more than, for example, the UC students who are using our textbook, but we're also seeing places where high school students are overtaking community college students who are using this textbook as well. By the last, you know, about 4 or 5 chapters, students who are using that in high school, they're actually performing higher than community college students. And part of it is because they're spending a longer time on it. And so they're getting much more flexible. They're getting much more deep insight into each chapter. Whereas I think community college students, they're going through it pretty fast at a good clip. And so it's been really hard. And so we have a lot of that data. That's stuff that we would love to share with you. We have publications. I could post a link.
Yeah, I should have clarified that the thing I described that we did at Stanford, I mean, we have not done it anywhere else. So it was just a course that we did here. And all I can say is that the students seem more interested in the class, but we developed worksheets, active learning. We wrote all of our own exercises. You know, we had to develop all the infrastructure ourselves, but all we can see is that students are more satisfied, but we're not trying to spread it to other places because this would be overwhelming for us. So we don't have any other particular data to go on, but certainly the students are generally pretty satisfied. But
one thing I forgot to say was, I think part of your question was about long-term outcomes. And we track the students through the year that they're actually in the course. But one of the things we are very interested in and trying to find funding for is tracking students even beyond that. It's just data wise, it's a little tricky to do. We have to get different kinds of permissions to do that. And so, but that is definitely on our list of things that we're really interested in. Especially we're interested in this cohort of students that we didn't even know existed, that we could get them excited about Algebra 2 again. We're like, is that a fluke? Can we do this systematically? Because that would be amazing. And so we're really trying to get some funding to be able to look at that kind of data.
There's a study out of UC Davis and Sacramento State that's doing exactly that work with several courses, tracking the students into the post-secondary. And there's very encouraging results in those data. They should be forthcoming.
Thank you. Gail.
Yes, thanks, Yvonne. I just wanted to throw something in as a veteran of developing curricula for many years. I was instrumental in some of the NSF curricula at middle grades and at high school. And something that we need to attend to is that curricula can be very successful with students and with teachers. They can be well-trained and implement it well. They can enjoy it. The students can enjoy it. And the parents can say, this is not a good curriculum. They have many different reasons. It doesn't look like what I took. It doesn't whatever. I know of districts that used our middle grades curriculum who were the top scoring districts in the state. The parents made them get rid of the curriculum because it didn't conform to what they expected. Again, I just talked to a teacher who had to get rid of an integrated high school curriculum that was extremely successful, and they were all well trained in using it. The students did very, very well. They went on to college. They did very well. The parents said, this is not a good curriculum. We need to have Algebra 1 geometry and Algebra 2. So that's the elephant in the room.
There's certainly a lot of stakeholders involved here. We heard about, the interaction between students and teachers. And again, that might just be part of our mental model of what it means to improve education. And then Gail's also bringing up parents. And then we're also talking about, well, even if we have all of these great experiences, how do we know where this goes in the future? So I guess I'd actually like to turn now to 3 big picture questions. And these are from Trina Wilkerson, Andrew Miller, and Mark Saul. And I actually am going to pose this to all of our panelists because they're big picture questions. And so Trina asks, Many states are in the middle of working to redesign their high school pathways. What are 1 to 2 important keys you would recommend that they keep in mind? Mark asks, what were the most difficult parts of designing your curriculum? Where were you least successful? And if you could talk to curriculum designers in 2030, what would you tell them? And Andrew asks, if I wanted to promote this kind of work in my local context, what would you suggest as a beginning to that? So that's a lot of questions. Don't feel pressured to answer, for all of you to answer each of them. But maybe we can just go in, say, alphabetical order by first name, and then pick a question and answer it. So I think if I'm alphabetizing correctly, I think that's Bill.
Okay, well, I'll answer Mark Saul's question because there are topics that are difficult to make engaging. And since we were trying to write a curriculum where that was a principle, that you wanted to do something and sort of start with something engaging, it's just easier to, if you're teaching statistics and you have an interesting data set that is somehow more engaging than say solving quadratic equations. And we were writing a curriculum where we were sort of trying to follow the standards. And so I could, I think what's difficult is there are just some topics that are inherently difficult, inherently hard to make engaging. And the one thing I think that we did was to recognize that real world contexts are not the only types of contexts that you can use to make a mathematical topic interesting. There are mathematical contexts. So mathematics itself can serve as a context. You can have a mathematical game or a mathematical puzzle that serves as a context for making a problem interesting. If you were talking to curriculum designers from 2030, what advice would you give them? There's an openly licensed K through 12 curriculum out there which you can pick up and adapt called Illustrative Mathematics. Why don't you start with that?
Thank you, Bill. Brian.
So I'll just take a stab at the first question on 1 or 2 most important keys to keep in mind is doing work. So I would so I'm going to speak in terms of what I've seen from what's going on in California with the math curriculum at high schools. So one thing is, of course, in the past, there have been obviously some problematic, bad outcomes in various ways, whether it's in terms of the students who are successful in certain kinds of courses, or just to even try to continue on in math and so forth. And so one thing is that, problems in the past are not necessarily, I often see it indicated that this means there's a problem with the content, right? And this is just bogus, that it's, it can be, we can modernize the pedagogy and modernize motivation, and that judgments about the content should be informed by awareness of where does it go, right? Like in biology, chemistry, and intro college, they need logarithms and so forth. So just when reforming or revising, courses, we should just keep in mind that improving the motivation may help a lot without having to, throw out a lot of the content. And yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Brian. Gail.
I'm gonna stick on the same question that Brian did, and I'm going to go back to my technology and argue that one of the big things that people should keep in mind is the role of technology and what it can do, and what it should be doing. There was just a recent study by some folks from Mexico, Ana Sacristan, and their claim is that what teachers are doing with technology in their teaching is what is old. They are using technology to do stuff that we did many years ago. It's not even clear that we need to have those answers, but that's what they're doing. And I would argue that we can rethink our curriculum from the perspective of let's trust technology. So you guys, you can do what, well, you all know this. You can get the answer to almost any calculus problem or any linear algebra problem or any trig problem by Googling one of those search engines, and it'll tell you not only the answer, but it'll tell you all the steps. And so that's a big message to us that we should not be teaching what is searchable. We should be thinking about how to use technology to leverage conceptual understanding of big ideas. So that's my main big takeaway. And the other one that I think they should keep in mind is they should be very focused on sense making, reasoning and sense making about whether it's using the mathematics as a context or using the real world as a context. Those are two key ideas.
And I'll go back to Mark Saul's question. What's the most difficult part of designing your curriculum? And dare you tell us where you were least successful? And part of the reason why we instrumented our textbook is that's exactly what we wanted to know, because we knew that our first try would be terrible, but we wanted to know where it was terrible. And so we really think that if I was to give advice to somebody who's going to be in 2030, I would say build into your curriculum a way of figuring out where it sucks, because it's gonna suck somewhere. And think about what you really want to measure, because we don't want to measure that students have covered this material, because even our interactive textbook, we know there are places they're not reading it, it turns out, and so it doesn't matter how beautiful our words and our figures are if they just don't even read it. And so, we want to know all of those things. And so that's why we're using the kind of data we're using in order to figure that out. And so we think of it as a continuous improvement process, that it's not that we make a curriculum and say, everyone, we're done, but that we continuously improve it over time. And we also really believe that this is really important to try these curricula in different places, in rural places, in urban places, in community college, in a 1 year versus 8 weeks versus 16 weeks versus 32-week context, because there might be things about those contexts that help us realize what we're doing wrong in the curriculum.
Thank you, G. Ricardo.
Yeah, the most difficult part of all of this was to eliminate the perception that having, and going back to something that you said, Gail, to having different names for alternatives to Algebra 2 was not making it easy for some students and then difficult for others. That the name, it doesn't mean the course is easier. Mathematical modeling and reasoning is not easier than Algebra 2. Data science is not easier than Algebra 2. Those are different ways to go forward. And for some students, those ways can be better than Algebra 2, like that. I would say that is the one. The other question you said, there tell us where you were least successful. Least successful was talking to the 4-year institutions at first. Most of them were concerned about this is going to affect financial aid for some students, until we talk them out of that idea. Yeah.
How would it affect financial aid?
There are more opportunities for students that are going into STEM immediately. Careers than going into the liberal arts, for instance, at least in Ohio. In other states, it may be different. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Well, it's now 55 after the hour, and I just wanted to take a note of how we've heard about the need for content expertise, for supporting teachers in different contexts, for understanding the role of technology, for understanding the interplay between different stakeholders in education, and above all, keeping an eye on what can be done so that we can make education better. And all of this means that we do need to lean on the expertise and experience of many people, including people on the ground like teachers, including school districts and parents, and looking at what it is that the students know, and also looking at the people who are writing the curriculum, who might be informing how the curriculum is being implemented. And I think one thing that we can all think about as we're moving forward is what can we be doing to help all of these communities and stakeholders hear each other more often. And with that, I'd like to pass the baton to Henry.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, I think hearing each other more often is such an important point. This goes back to what Bill was saying about lip service, that there were a lot of stakeholders here. There were a lot of different forms of expertise and experience. And if we're going to make real progress on these questions, we've got to bring all this together. And so I hope we all think about this going forwards. So let's take a moment to thank all 5 of our speakers and our panelists. I've loved hearing everyone. Yep. I'd also like to say a special thanks to Dev and Tyler. They haven't spent a lot of time on screen today, but they've done so much behind the scenes to actually pull this off, make it all work. It wouldn't have happened without them. So we're very grateful for their contribution. Meanwhile, thanks also to the audience for participating. We got a great turnout. There were some fascinating comments and questions. It's given me a lot to think about, and thank you so much for coming. So with that, we'll bring things to a close.
Thank you, everybody.